Welcome to Disciple Dojo and our continuing walk through the lyrics of the Psalms. So we're going to look at Psalm 16. I want to give a little background from the ancient Near East that will help flesh out this psalm a little bit more, and that will show the contrast between other ancient Near East petitions to their gods and how this psalm was used by God's people, and then particularly how it was picked up on by the New Testament authors, because this psalm is quoted on numerous occasions in the New Testament. But first, let's read it. Psalm 16, a Miktam of David. Keep me safe, O God, for in you I take refuge. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good thing. As for the saints who are in the land, they are the glorious ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those will increase who run after other gods. I will not pour out their libations of blood or take up their names on my lips. Lord, you have assigned me my portion and my cup. You have made my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. I will praise the Lord who counsels me. Even at night, my heart instructs me. I've set the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure, because you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with your joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. So as usual, we're going to look at this passage in the original Hebrew. We're going to note some of the insights from the Greek translation done before the time of Jesus, which is what the New Testament authors were quoting from in the book of Acts. We're going to see what we find. So as usual on the screen, this is my woodenly literal translation. I want you, even if this is all gibberish to you, like you can't read Hebrew, that's fine. I want you to at least be able to, as closely as possible, kind of map it to the English. That's why my translation in the Psalm series is so utterly literal. It's not good English. It doesn't make for a good reading translation. But my hope is that for serious study, it will let you see things that you may not catch in more idiomatic or more thought-for-thought translations. Those are great, and those are helpful for bringing out the meaning of passages. But we also want to know as much as possible, especially if you don't have the biblical languages, like if you can't read Hebrew or Greek, you want to at least have access to a pretty woodenly literal translation just for the purpose of studying. So it begins, Miktam le David. Now, this word, Miktam, pretty much all of the modern English translations, and even the King James, Miktam, they just left it as it is. So Miktam, Miktam, Miktam. There's no consensus on what it means. That's why even the Tanakh just leaves it as a Miktam. Now, one thing I think is interesting, though, and this may be a clue, is the ancient Jewish translators who translated the Psalms into Greek, they translated it as stelographia to David. A stele is a stone engraved like a monument, a stele, S-T-L-E, and graphia, writing or inscription. So this is translated by the Septuagint as a stele inscription, like an actual inscription in stone that you would put on a monument. So in the Septuagint, an inscription to David. And so in the Septuagint, at least, you could make a pretty good argument that the Le David is something like for David, to David, in honor of David, rather than David himself having written this. The Hebrew is ambiguous, the Greek a little less so, but it's worth keeping in mind. That's why I think a good way to translate Le David is just Davidic. This is a Davidic psalm. Whether David wrote it, whether it's patterned after him, whether it was written in honor of him, I don't think it matters. It begins, Shomreini El, guard me El. Now it doesn't use Elohim. That's a very standard word for God. This is using El. It just means God, capital G-O-D. And it's also the name, if you watched our series here in the dojo on the Baal epic, it's the name of the high god in the Canaanite cycle. It's also where the modern Arabic term Allah, which is what Christians call God, as well as Muslims, those all come from this El. And so God's being addressed with this title for the highest God possible. For I take refuge. We've seen this in the Psalms, and we will see it more in the Psalms. Now, verse 2, this is where we come to the first challenge in how we understand this. And so this whole section is going to be difficult, and the commentaries note this. So I'm going to try as best I can to walk you through some of the issues. It literally begins with Amart la'Adonai. And in Hebrew, this says Amart. Amart is you said. It's a second person. You said to Yahweh, to the Lord. But the Septuagint translates it with I said to the Lord. And so you see that among the different translations. For instance, NIV, I say to the Lord. King James, O my soul, thou hast said unto the Lord. King James actually introduces this, O my soul, which is not in the actual Hebrew text. It's not even in the Greek text. The old JPS, I have said unto the Lord. The Tanakh, I say to the Lord. So why are the Hebrew, the Jewish translations like the Tanakh, the JPS 1917, why did they go with the Greek reading, the Septuagint reading, I say to the Lord, rather than the text that's actually in the Hebrew? I mean, you can see as clear as can be, Amart. That is, you say to the Lord. Even the Net Bible, and the Net Bible does a phenomenal job whenever there are issues like this of bringing it up and explaining it in their translator notes. So the Net Bible says, I say to the Lord, and you would expect there to be a note here, but there's not. There's no note. The only note at 16:2 is down at this bottom part, the later half of the verse. So I was like, what's going on? Why do some translations say you say to the Lord and others say I say to the Lord? And so this is where you have to turn to the commentaries and like really dig. So think about Bible study as, again, it's like excavating and archaeology, like reading through the psalm is just getting the lay of the land. Then going through verse by verse in different English translations is like getting in there with a bulldozer and kind of moving things up out of the way. Then reading it through in the original languages is like getting down with a shovel and actually digging, because you think, okay, there might be something here. Let me dig around. Sometimes you have to get rid of the shovel or the pickaxe, and you have to pick up a spade or even like a little toothbrush or a dental tool and really get down at a level of fine detail. And this series would be forever long if we did that with every verse. But I want to show you an example to just give you a feel. This is Disciple Dojo, so I want you to see, I say keep training. I want to show you a little bit of the method behind what is involved in biblical training at times when it's issues where there's some disagreement or it's just takes some digging. So some have suggested this Amart there was originally in the original manuscripts, there was probably a yod here, a little like the letter Y in Hebrew, but it's like literally the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It's like a little tiny apostrophe. And so some have suggested that like right here, there might have been an apostrophe and in subsequent copying it got lost. Certainly that's possible. That's always possible. But others have suggested different things. For instance, in the Anchor Bible commentary, Dahud, he translates it I said, which would be amarti. That's how you'd say I said. Amar, amara, amarta, amart, amarti. I said. But this is amart, you said. And what Dahud suggests is the consonantal, and that's what he means, the consonants, because remember, there were no vowels. Amart, and this is transliterated Hebrew, is Phoenician orthography for amarti. So he's suggesting, no, this is what we have here this is kind of a variant spelling. This is how in Phoenicians in particular, you would spell amarti as amart. It would be identical. And then he suggests an example. Isaiah 47:10, amart is read in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1 QIS, Isaiah scroll, as amarti. So it's possible what we have here is just another way of spelling the word that inconveniently happens to be identical between first person and second person. Now, Rolf Jacobson, in his commentary on the Psalms, he also translates it as I say, and he says reading amarti, meaning that's how he's reading it in his translation, with the Septuagint and the Syriac in place of the Masoretic texts, that's what MT stands for, amart, you say. So Jacobson is saying, look, the Hebrew says you say, yes, but the Masoretic text is much later, and these older translations, even though they're translations, they both translated it as I say. So he's taking the Septuagint reading over the Masoretic text reading, not just because it's the Septuagint and he gives that pride of place, but also because the Syriac reading seems to agree with the Septuagint. And so this is where I think, I'm not an expert, but I think this is where the King James got their translation from of, "Oh, my soul." I think that what they are saying is, okay, the Hebrew clearly says, "You say to Adonai," to Yahweh. And this "you say," amart, it's a feminine second person. So the "you" of "you say" is a feminine subject. And since the psalmist is the only one talking, the thing doing the saying is likely the psalmist himself. But the psalmist is masculine, it's a male, so that wouldn't make sense. This doesn't seem to be written by a woman, but soul is feminine. Even in a man, they would use the word to describe their soul or themself, their life, as it would be a feminine word. So I suspect that that's how the King James came to, "O my soul, thou hast said unto the Lord." That's how they preserve the "you say" that the Hebrew text is clearly showing, but also factor in the "I say." How can I say and you say? Well, if I am saying to my soul, which is then saying to God. So it's sort of, I think, if that's what's going on here, I think it's a pretty ingenious way of kind of holding both texts in tension. So that's another option. And that's the one that the Lexham English Bible seems to have gone with as well. "O my soul, you have said to Yahweh." There's one more way that this can be interpreted. And to me, this one is the most interesting. And I actually think it makes the most sense. I'm tentatively convinced by it. And this comes from Peter Craigie's volume in Word Biblical, Psalms 1 through 50. And Craigie translates it, "You have said to the Lord," and then the next part of the lines, "You are my master, my welfare indeed rests on you," which we'll get to that later. But you can see there's two footnotes here. Kind of the annoying thing about Word Biblical is the notes aren't footnotes, they're actually at the next section. So you have to turn and you have to do a little hunting to find it. But here's what he says. I'll make this a little bigger so you can see it. He says, "Most translators, ancient and modern, have assumed the verb is first person singular and have restored a final yod." So they've translated it as if it said amarti instead of amart, both Christian and Jewish. And he's suggesting ancients, meaning like the Septuagint. That's where the Septuagint comes from, is that the Septuagint even assumed that there was originally a yod on the end. There's some evidence in the Hebrew manuscripts for the final yod, and he quotes Darasi 4:8. And so he says there actually is some manuscript evidence that points towards it having a final yod, or the form without yod may be interpreted as an example of Phoenician type orthography. And then he cites Dahud, who we just looked at. But here's what Craigie says. "But it is best to keep the consonantal text, which could be vocalized as either masculine or feminine, as in the Masoretic text, second person singular." And so what he's saying is, in the consonant text of the Hebrew, like without the vowel pointings, the only way you know that this is feminine versus masculine is these two little dots right here under this final tau. If these two dots were a different mark, then this would be a masculine form. So he's saying, forget all the vowels for a minute. In the consonantal text, it can be either masculine or feminine. And he argues that it should be read as masculine. So the error is not in the text itself, but in the Masoretic scribes pointing these consonants with the vowel points that indicate feminine rather than masculine. So he's saying, no, you should just read this as second person masculine, "you say." And since it's masculine, you don't have to import some feminine subject of the verb like "my soul," which is not in the text at all. You can just leave it as "you say to the Lord." And so he says, if the second person is maintained, it brings out clearly the contrast between the psalmist's view, which is what we have in verse 1 and the second half of verse 4 through verse 11, and the person with whom he is in dialogue. And that's verses 2 through the first half of verse 4. So we'll come back to that in just a second. And this, if you're following along and your eyes are crossing and you're just like, what does any of this matter? Stick with me. This is why it matters. You can read this whole section, verses 2, 3, and 4, in two different ways. And I'm going to show you the literal wording, and then we'll look at maybe we call it the traditional reading. And then I'm going to show you Craigie's suggested reading, which a number of scholars hold to. It's not just him, but he's one example. And then you can see for yourself which makes the most sense. So under the traditional reading, taking the Septuagint and the Syriac, I said, it would read as, I said to the Lord, my Lord are you, Adonai Atah, like you are my Lord. My goodness is not above you. Some translations will say, my goodness is not beyond you, or there's nothing above you that I can look to for good. Like you are the source of all goodness. My goodness, not above you. And then under the traditional reading, for holy ones who are in the land, likdoshim, this is the kadashim, holy ones, we would say maybe for the saints. For saints, asher ba'aretz, who are in the land, hema, they. Va'adirei kal hafzi bam. And the magnificent ones, or the uplifted ones, you could even translate this as nobles. It just means like big shots, people of high standing, glorious ones. All my delight is in them. So the traditional reading, you're my Lord, Adonai. This is not the name of God. This is not Yahweh. This is the word for Lord, Adonai. You're my Lord or master. My goodness is not beyond or not above you. You're not part of a pantheon. You're not like Baal, who El is over. No, you are the top. You're the head honcho. All my goodness is in you. And then therefore, the psalmist is saying, and for the saints, this would be kadoshim, would be saints, like the righteous people. For the saints or the holy ones who are in the land, they and the magnificent ones. So this is talking about two groups of good people, the holy ones in the land and the magnificent ones. All my delight is in them. So the psalmist is saying, I delight in the good people in the land. You're my good God, and the people in the land that are doing good, walking with you, my fellow saints, that's where I get my delight, not those who are running after false gods. Because, verse 4, they will increase or multiply atzvotam, their sorrows after or other they chase. So those who are chasing after, and some translations will put in like other gods, acharei Elohim means other gods, and so they're saying this is probably short for that. So those who chase after, hasten after, maharu, those who run after other gods, they will multiply their sorrows, unlike the holy ones in the land. And in the second half of verse 4, he says, I will not pour out their pouring outs. I will not, and this is the kind of, there's no English way to do it. This is the same form of the same verb in Hebrew. So it's, I will not pour out their pourings out. I will not pour out their libations. Libation is just a drink offering. I'm not going to pour one out for them, we'd say. Why? Because they're midam, from blood or bloodshed. In other words, I'm not worshiping with these people. I'm not going to participate in their paganism. I'm not going to pour out their bloody drink offerings. And not I will lift their names upon my lip. So the traditional reading is saying, you're my God, I'm with you, and those who are also with you in the land, all my delight is in them. That's who I'm with, not those who hasten after other gods. And I'm not going to pour out their drink offerings. I'm not even going to bear their names on my lips. That's the traditional reading. But that all presupposes that it's I said to the Lord, that the psalmist is saying all this to God. However, what Craigie and others have suggested is this is not the psalmist just talking to God. This is the psalmist interacting with those people who he's surrounded by. Here's what I mean. Look how it would read if this is the psalmist talking to the evildoers in the land. You said to Yahweh, you are my Lord. My goodness is not above you. So that's what the worshiper's saying. But then what the worshiper says to the kadoshim, and Craigie suggests bringing this verb, like the verb carries over down into here. Amarta, you said to Yahweh, la Adonai. You also said, that would be in parentheses, to kadoshim, to the holy ones, and holy ones which are in the land. This is also a way that you can describe pagan priests or even false gods. They would be called Kedushim. That's what they would call themselves. In fact, pagan cult prostitutes, like the cult prostitutes that you went to a shrine or a high place and worshiped the Canaanite gods by having sex with, they were called Kedushim. And so what Craigie suggests is, no, you just take this Amart, as you said, and continue the train of thought. You said to Yahweh, you're my Lord, my goodness is not above you, but to the gods of the land, to the Kedushim, they, Hema, are the magnificent ones in whom is all my delight. In other words, they are the ones that I think are the magnificent ones. And so this would not be translated as like the saints and the good people of the land. This would be translated as the syncretist saying, yeah, God, you're my God, and all my goodness is in you. And then turning and going to the pagan gods or the pagan priests or the cult prostitutes and saying, but they're the magnificent ones and my delight's in them. And the Septuagint translates it possibly in that way as he magnified all his desires in them. And so then we have the psalmist saying, warning, they multiply their sorrows who go after other gods. And then the Septuagint translates verse 4, their sicknesses were multiplied, after these they hastened. And so here's how Craigie translates it, like sort of a smoother translation. You've seen the woodenly literal one that I put on the screen, just showing you what the words are. So here would be the, for lack of a better word, non-traditional way, but the way, ironically, that keeps the Hebrew text more intact. It says, you have said to the Lord, you are my master, my welfare indeed rests on you. And then there it is, the parenthetical, but what they said, to the holy ones who are in the land, they are my mighty ones. All my pleasure is in them. And then back to the psalmist, they will multiply their pains. They have acquired another and another God. I will not pour out their libations of blood. I will not take their names upon my lips. So this is the psalmist in dialogue with pagans in the land running after the holy ones and thinking that they're the magnificent ones. In other words, worshiping at the high places, going to the pagan gods, appealing to another El rather than Yahweh as the true El. And I love what Craigie says in the comment section of his commentary. After he's proposed his translation and given the reasons why in the notes, then in the comment, he says this, the translation of this section is so problematical, see the notes, that the comment is deliberately kept short, lest too much should be built on too fragile a foundation. So I love that, first of all. He's saying this is, we can't be dogmatic here. There are so many challenges in the text itself in translating it that depending on how you translate something, it's going to lead in different directions. He says, so I'm going to keep it brief, but this is what I'm suggesting. He says, the psalmist recalls the words of an acquaintance or a typical fellow citizen of his time, which in one sense represent temptation and in another sense represent something abhorrent to the psalmist. The acquaintance is a syncretist, wanting the best of two worlds. He vocalizes the appropriate words to God, you are my master, but his faith has an elastic quality so that he can also trip off his tongue the appropriate words to the foreign deities, the holy ones. They are my mighty ones. The acquaintance represents temptation, for he appears to have double protection in a time of crisis. He represents something to be abhorred, for his words are clearly in contravention of the first commandment. And you see this in cultures today where syncretism is a temptation, where, yes, I'll go to church on Sunday, I'll go to the revivals, I'll pray the prayer, I'll wear a cross around my neck, I'll put a little Santo Niño on my jeepney dashboard, in the Philippines, for instance. I'll do the Christian thing, but when it hits the fan, and when I need something, I'm praying to all of them. I'm going to also go to the shaman. I'm going to also go to the temple and burn some incense to the local god. Yeah, I'll worship Jesus. I'll sing praises in church on Sunday, but I'm also going to hedge my bets and appease these other gods as well. And he says, though their double indemnity approach to life was attractive, it would culminate in pain. For another god in addition to the Lord had been acquired, having now dispensed with temptation by seeing it for what it really is, in the first half of verse 4, the psalmist is able to move on to his own affirmation of integrity and confidence. While the acquaintance sought to serve two masters, the psalmist renounces one and affirms the other in closely parallel language. He refuses to participate in the worship of false gods or take their names upon his lips. as his acquaintance has done. In verse 3, God was his portion and cup. Only the lips that abstained from pronouncing the names of foreign deities could drink the cup of blessing provided by God. And then he cites Hosea 2:17. In Hebrew, it's 3:19, which says, I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and no more shall they be mentioned by name. The parallel verse he's pointing to that would go along with this. And so if that is the correct reading, if this is the psalmist in, I don't want to say dialogue because the other person is not talking back, but if the psalmist is not saying, I delight in the saints who are in the land, but rather he's giving the words that the syncretists in the land have said, you're my God, there's no one above you, but then going and worshiping and pouring out libations of blood and all of that stuff. And so the psalmist then, in contrast to the syncretist, says Yahweh, and this does use the name of the Lord. Yahweh is my allotted portion and my cup. Your allotted portion is what you would receive. And this is Levitical language. When Israel was entering the land, the Levites didn't get their own land. They were allotted portions of the land throughout all the tribes, and it was determined by lot. And God even said to the Levites, I am going to be your portion. You're not going to get tribal land like the other tribes because you are my tribe of priests in particular. I am your inheritance. So this is Levitical language permeating this psalm as well. Yahweh is my allotted portion and my cup. Your cup is just it's a figure of speech used to denote a situation that you're experiencing or encountering. It's like when Jesus prayed, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. And literally, he says to God, Ata tomich gorali, you holding or grasping my lot, like casting lots. So he's basically saying you control my destiny. Casting lots. We have a video here. What does it mean to cast lots? And it's just a way of taking the decision out of human hands and putting it in God's hands. And so this is language basically saying, God, you control my lot. We might say in a modern parallel, like the dice are in your hands, God. And because of that, verse 6, this is literally in Hebrew, what it says is chavalim naflu li bana'imim, literally ropes or cords or like ropes. They fall to me in delights. So how do you render that in English? Well, ropes, this has to do with boundary markers, boundary lines. The lines fall like when my apportionment is allotted. This is the language of tribal allotment. When Israel went into the land, the tribe's lands were determined by lots. And so this is saying, since Yahweh is my portion and he's the one grasping my lot, then the boundary lines, we could say, the ropes, the boundary lines, they're going to fall for me delightfully, literally in delights. Na'imim. It's a plural. This is actually where the word Naomi comes from. Naomi in the book of Ruth. And that's why she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Don't call me delightful, call me bitter. So because God's the one holding the lots, my boundary lines are falling in pretty good places. And so Afnachalath, Shafra alai. Surely an inheritance of beauty upon me. My nachal, what I'm going to inherit, is going to be beautiful. And so because of that, I will bless Yahweh, Asher Ya'atzani, who advised or instructed me. And then how did Yahweh instruct him? Surely, leloth, literally it's nights, but we would say at night or even maybe nightly since it's plural. Surely by night, Yisruni, and this can mean rebuke or chastise, discipline. It can also mean instruct. And since it's parallel to Ya'atzani, something like, coaching or prodding or, that kind of instruction, surely nightly they instruct me. And who instruct me? Kill your thigh, literally my kidneys. Now, some translations say my heart, or something like that, or my conscience rebukes me, or by night, my conscience instructs me, by night, my heart, reproves me, or something like that. But it's kidneys, literally. And it's because just like we say, ooh, I feel that in my gut, or what's your gut reaction? Like gut, that's the word for bowels. That's the word for intestines. And in English, though, it means just feeling it at the gut level. I don't even have a better way to say that because we use the anatomical term gut to describe that source of feeling. Well, Hebrew, they, instead of heart and gut, it was heart and kidneys. The kidneys were the source of emotion and how you felt things in ancient Hebrew. So the psalmist is blessing God because God's the one who advised him. And by night, he feels it in his guts. He feels it in his kidneys. God's instruction is not just through Torah and the commandments, but it's also inward instruction as well. And so because of that, then the psalmist can conclude, I have placed Yahweh before me continually. For my right hand, I will not be shaken. And so this is his way of saying, like, because I've put God before me, not the pagan idols, not running after other gods, I'm not going to be shaken. And so it could be like God is his right hand, or it could be God is at my right hand, therefore I will not be shaken, something like that. You can compare the translations and see how they handle it, but that's the general idea. And so because of that, therefore my heart rejoices. And here's the word lave. So just like kidneys is how you feel, heart is also a seat of emotion. And so the psalmist's heart rejoices. And this next part is different depending on the Hebrew or the Greek. In Hebrew, it says literally vayagel, which means and he exalts, or and he shouts for joy. Kavodi. Kavodi literally means my glory. Kavod is the word for glory. You might remember our episode with Dr. Rebecca Eidstrom where we talked about what is the glory of the Lord, and this is the word, kavod. But it's weird that it's talking about my glory shouting for joy. And so the Septuagint translates it with glosa mu, my tongue shouts for joy. So again, just like we had to do at the very beginning of the psalm when it was like, is it you say? Is it I say? Why is the difference? What's going on there? That's how, and we're not going to do that in this video because this video is already long enough, but that's how you would then go on and say, okay, what does it mean that my glory shouts for joy? Or is this a case where the Hebrew Masoretic text does not preserve the correct reading and the Septuagint actually has the correct reading, which provides a neat parallel, my heart rejoicing, my tongue shouting for joy. So I'll leave that up to you, Disciple Dojo viewers, this could be kind of like a little project for you. Which of these translations in the middle of verse 9 makes the most sense? But regardless, either way, he's talked about his heart, possibly his tongue, or possibly just his glory, which could be a euphemism for, you use your tongue to glorify. So it could be a way of describing his tongue. And then the third, surely, basari, my flesh, yishkein lebetach, will dwell for safety or in security or securely. So because God is his portion, because God is his cup, because God holds his lot in his hands, he will never be shaken. And therefore his heart rejoices, he shouts for joy, and his body, his flesh, will dwell in safety. And then comes verse 10. This is what the New Testament authors picked up on. Kilo ta'azov nafshi l'she'ol. For you will not abandon nafshi, my soul, to Sheol. You will not allow your Holy One to look at or to see shachath, pit. So here we have two of the words in Hebrew for the realm of the dead, Sheol and Shachath, the grave, the pit. And so he's saying, you're not going to abandon me to Sheol. You're not going to let me look at Shachath, look at the pit. And why? Todieni arach hayam. You have made me know. You have made, we'd say you made known to me, but it's you have made me know a path living, or a path of life. That's the opposite of Shachath and Sheol. Fullness of joys, like we would say, just the full joy, all the joys, as much of the joys as you can imagine. Eth, which means with, panecha, your face. And face means your presence, or before you. That's how you'd say that as well. It's literally face, but it means like in your presence, before your face, something like that. All the joys are before the face of God. Na'imoth, there's the word where Naomi comes from that we saw up here earlier. Delights are in your right hand, and right hand means like seated at the right hand, like in the favorable position. So that's where all of the delights are, is being in God's favor. Netzach, forever or always. So this, if you take this as a stele inscription, then this is like a proclamation that's specifically made public, and it would provide a tangible opposite to the various pagan Canaanite approaches that people in Israel continued to take. The syncretists in Israel continued to go after the other gods. Even if you don't read this in the non-traditional way, even if you read this in what we would say a more traditional manner, either way, you can read this both ways and it makes sense. That's what I think is fascinating about it. But this would then be, if this is an inscription, a Miktam, if that's like a public document, this would be a monument against giving in to the temptation to run after other gods. And it would stand as a perpetual witness to having Yahweh as your true source, your inheritance. You know, monuments were set up many times to mark places of inheritance or to mark territory. You would put a monument somewhere, or you would build an altar somewhere, or you would make something physical. You would raise an Ebenezer, if you are familiar with that old hymn. And so if that's what this is, and I think you can make a compelling case that it is, how does it compare to what Israel was being tempted to go after? Well, we actually have something of a parallel from Ugaritic. Again, if you've seen our series here, and I feel like most people watching this have, because it's by far the most popular series I've ever done for some reason, where we read through the Baal account from Ugaritic, we actually have a prayer that was also discovered in Ugaritic. And this is Context of Scripture, Volume 1, number 152. It's called A Sufferer's Salvation. And so Foster, in his introduction to the translation of it, says it comes from Ugaritic, where scribal schools adopted and adapted the Mesopotamian curriculum, that's Babylonian, like the Babylon teachings, in the late Bronze Age. It's preserved in a single fragmentary exemplar. And so there's like one fragment of it, and there's a gap of lines at the beginning, and some of the parts break off, and it's not exactly clear. But this is something like, think of this as an Ugaritic pagan psalm, and the person's suffering. And it says, and in pagan culture, you want to know why? You seek out the gods through omens, through divination, through all the things that the Torah told Israel they were not to do. And here's an example of what they would do. The sufferer writes, "My omens were obscure. They became like," and then it's broken. We don't know. "The diviner could not reach a ruling concerning me. The judge would give no sign." And this means like the gods are not showing what they want to know. "The omens were confused. The oracles mixed up. Dream interpreters used up the incense. Diviners, the lambs." So you would, burn incense, you'd sacrifice lambs. "Learned men debated the tablets about my case. They could not say when my affliction would run its course. My family gathered round to bend over me before my time." Like the family this is like they're calling in hospice at this point. He says, "My next of kin stood ready for the wake. My brothers were bathed in blood like men possessed." And this could possibly reflect the belief in blood as a ritualistic tool, somehow that life is in the blood. That's a biblical refrain. And, Israel was not to eat the blood and was not to do blood manipulation outside of the temple tabernacle. So manipulating blood in some way. And in this case, bathed in blood. Does that mean they were drinking blood? Does that mean they were literally pouring it on themselves? Kind of like when the prophets of Baal were cutting themselves in Elijah's showdown, trying to get Baal's attention. Is that what's going on here? Whatever it is, they were trying to do everything they could on behalf of this dying person. "My sisters sprinkled me with fine oil from the press," anointing someone with oil to get them better, "until the Lord raised my head and brought me back to life from the dead." And this is not the Lord Yahweh. "Until Marduk," that's the Babylonians' chief god. The Babylon version of Baal is Marduk. Marduk is the storm god. He's also the creator god. He's the bigwig in Babylonian theology. So this is a psalm about Marduk saving this person. "Until Marduk raised my head and brought me back to life from the dead." And then he talks about his symptoms. He couldn't eat, drink, sleep. He'd lay awake. "I would lie awake my whole night through. My heart, something me, my mind, something me." Again, this is broken and fragmented. But notice again, talking about at night and my heart and my mind. That's very similar to what we see in the psalmist talking about my heart, my kidneys at night instructed me. And so he's wasting away. He was anxious. And this line has parallel in the Psalms. My tears had to serve as my sustenance. In Psalm 42 and Psalm 80, it'll talk about this same concept when the psalmist is lamenting. So this is like a pagan lament. But then he wants to make sure everybody knows the source. Lest Marduk be forgotten, that Marduk be praised. Were it not for Marduk, breath had gone from me. He goes on, I praise what the Lord Marduk has done. I praise what the angry God has done. I praise. Praise. Do not be bashful, but praise. He is Marduk. I entreat him. It was he who smote me, then was merciful to me. He scuttled me, then he moored me. He dashed me down, then grabbed me as I fell. He scattered me wide, then garnered me. He thrust me away, then gathered me in. He threw me down, then lifted me high. He snatched the jaw of death. He raised me up from hell. He smashed my smiter's weapon. He wrested the shovel from the digger of my grave. He opened my shrouded eyes. He made my speech intelligible, my ears something, and then the text breaks off. This to me is a fascinating parallel account of what Israel was hearing from their neighbors, their pagan psalms, and then reading Israel's psalms in light of this. The contrasts are, to me, what's so astounding. What's interesting is this is by someone who didn't die. I mean, clearly, this sufferer, it says, Marduk raised my head and brought me back to life from the dead. He wasn't literally dead. That's hyperbolic language. He was, we would say, at death's door. And so Marduk raising him up from hell, snatching from the jaw of death. Watch the series we've done here on the Baal myth if you want to see more of this and what it meant in the ancient world, as well as in the Psalms. These are stock figures of speech. But notice that the Ugaritic sufferer didn't die. He just was really sick, and then he praises Marduk for bringing him back, even though he makes it clear it was Marduk who put him there to begin with. And so likewise with the psalmist, whether it was David or whether it was a psalmist writing, in honor of David or so, whoever the author is, they didn't literally die either. The phrase, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, you will not allow your Holy One to see the pit. That's just stock ancient Near East way of saying, I thought I was done, but you rescued me. So some of you may be getting nervous. Why then would the New Testament authors in the book of Acts say that this was prophesying about Jesus coming back from the dead? Well, this is why we can't look at the New Testament's use of the Old Testament as simple proof texting. The New Testament authors, I would suggest that, Peter, Paul, the other apostles, they knew full well that the psalmist didn't literally die and was brought back. And they also knew that the Psalms were talking about things going on at the time. But the Psalms, being scripture, had a deeper meaning, had a fuller meaning, had a prophetic aspect to them, especially the Davidic Psalms. And so I love the way Michael Wilcock lays this out in his commentary on Psalms. He says, this isn't the first time this has happened. As far back as Psalm 2, and remember Psalm 2 is the Messianic Psalm. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool. As far back as Psalm 2, we caught a glimpse of this question of prophecy and fulfillment. The chapters on second meanings in C.S. Lewis's reflection on the Psalms illuminate it wonderfully. Here we should note just two facts. It could be that when David composed Psalm 16, and Wilcock does take it as David being the author. I'm not completely convinced, but again, I think you can read it that way. I think the evidence leans against it. Regardless, though, it could be that when David composed Psalm 16, he was not thinking of the afterlife at all, though he may have been. So David saying things like not being abandoned to Sheol, not seeing the pit, may just be normal, just like in the Ugaritic pagan hymn. It may just be a normal way to talk about being at the brink of death. Or he might have been thinking about the underworld. He might have been thinking more existentially. We don't know. But in God's providence, the words he wrote were going to apply with uncanny accuracy centuries later to his great descendant. Just like in Psalm 22, which we'll see when we get there, David might have meant, or the author, whoever it was, might have meant one thing. But when it's seen through the lens of the events of the gospel, it takes on a whole deeper meaning. And so with hindsight, the witnesses to Christ's resurrection, the apostles, realized that they had seen a man who, when actually in the grave, had not been abandoned to it, who was most truly God's Holy One, and who was now, in the fullest sense, seated eternally at God's right hand. So after Pentecost, when things set in, the apostles reread the Psalms that they had known so well and saw things that they had never seen before. I mean, I think we can't say one way or the other. I think this is probably the kind of stuff that Jesus showed to the two on the road to Emmaus, when it says he took them through the scriptures and showed him how the Son of Man must suffer and die and resurrect and all this. I think this might have been the kind of thing that he was showing them, was like, do you think the Psalms were just about normal everyday sufferers in Israel? Or do you think that they pointed towards, that they were shadows of, previews of coming attractions of the true Israelite, the one who through corporate solidarity would embody all of Israel? And so thus, when we go back and we read Israel's prayers, we are seeing the identity and the mission and the fulfillment that Israel's Messiah was going to bring about. And that's what it means to say, thus the scriptures were fulfilled in Jesus. Not that there's some prediction here in Psalm 16, and then Jesus specifically fulfilled that predictive promise. That is not what's going on in this psalm. Jesus is filling fully. That's what it means to fulfill. He's filling fully this whole picture of the devoted, righteous, holy one, and God truly not abandoning his soul to Sheol and not letting him see the pit, making known to him the path of life by literally raising him up where he is seated at the right hand forever. My hope in this video is that it at least is sort of pulling back the curtain and letting you see what Bible translators have to grapple with when they're trying to figure out how to translate this psalm. And so then you'll maybe read it a little more carefully. Maybe you'll pay more attention to the footnotes in whichever translation you're reading. More than anything, I hope you'll compare various translations if you are someone who can't read Hebrew and Greek. That's okay. That's why we put like a dozen different translations on the screen, so you can see how the translators have to wrestle with the text in order to give something that we can read in English and understand and use in worship and memorize for personal edification and daily devotional and all that kind of stuff. So this is a fascinating psalm, especially given how short it is. And it also, I think, is a great look at how the New Testament uses the Psalms. And we want to be really careful because there's a lot of misunderstanding. And what were the New Testament authors doing? Were they just pulling stuff out of context randomly? No, they weren't dummies. They knew their Psalms. They had been singing these Psalms their entire lives. If you watch The Chosen, if you've seen any of the episodes, one of the things I really like about that show, there's some critiques I have, but one of the things I really like about the show is how they will just have the disciples just randomly throw out some phrases from the Psalms here and there. And it's because they are so steeped in it. It's just part of their culture. So when a situation arises, there's a Psalm verse that you could say that would encapsulate that situation, but only if you have internalized, only if you've taken the Psalms in, only if they are your nourishment, your daily bread. And they were for the authors of the New Testament. They were for the apostles. And after Jesus's death, resurrection, and sending of the Holy Spirit, the Psalms were read with new eyes. The Psalms are quoted more than any other Old Testament book in the New Testament. And especially during the Passion period in the Gospels, you can hardly turn a page without hitting a psalm. So that's my hope in all of this. What is this series for? Again, this is not to exegete the Psalms and you become a Psalms expert. I'm not a Psalms expert. What it is an exploration. We're taking a long, strolling, meandering, guided tour through the biggest book in the Bible. So hopefully you found it interesting. This is a longer video than usual in this series, but it's because there were some complex issues that we needed to kind of dig around in and sit with. So we'll call it a day for now. Stay tuned when we're going to read Psalm 17 in our next video. If you haven't seen our previous videos in this series, maybe this is the first video that's popped up from Disciple Dojo on your algorithm, check out the others. We have a whole playlist here. I'll link it in the video description below. If you want to support this ministry, you like what we're doing, best way you can do it is subscribe to this channel, enable notifications when you do, like this video, maybe share it with others, leave a comment, any of the interaction stuff, super helpful. And if you would like to support this ministry a little more, if you're like, I actually really want to help this ministry, Disciple Dojo, we are fully nonprofit. We get, I mean, a little bit of our budget comes from what we make here on YouTube, but the vast majority of our operating budget, it comes directly from donors, people that just believe in this ministry and give either one time or on a monthly basis. And so if you want to do that, head over to our website and check out our Dojo donors page. We don't do Patreon. We don't have memberships. We don't nickel and dime. We just say, this ministry can't exist without donors, and if you appreciate it and want to see it continue, then we'd invite you to become a Dojo donor. That's a real tangible way to help us keep going. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more here at Disciple Dojo. As always, keep training.